This is going to be the second part of our Torah series. If you missed any part of it, we have the Genesis series, which does the first part of the Torah. And here we're going to be doing Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is the second part of the Torah. And we're going to look specifically at the life of Moses. So we're going to look at his life, everything that went on. You see in my background, we have the parting of the Red Sea. We're just going to kind of keep with this theme of the Exodus the whole time, thinking of how God takes us on these journeys, on paths into new places, and he provides the way to do that. And so this is a really great study of God as deliverer and redeemer. And so in general, we're going to walk through the entire study of the Torah. This is some of the initial books of the Old Testament, the ones that Moses wrote down. And we just see these as being very historically part of the Jewish community as well as the church community, as grounding for their faith and everything that they believed about God and everything that they needed to know. And so these are considered the books of the law. This is what David had to read when he was in his day. This is what in even the New Testament, a lot of the time that they're basing their readings on and things. And so we're going to continue just digging into these books. Like I said, if you missed the Genesis series, it is well worth studying the book of Genesis to kind of get the background as we lead into the Exodus series. And Exodus picks up exactly where Genesis left off. So Genesis covered that huge swath of human history, and then Exodus is going to pick up right where it left off. Joseph and the whole family of Jacob have moved down to Egypt, and they're going to live there for like 400 years. And that's exactly where the book picks up. It picks up with them moving into Egypt. And so we just see this continuity through these 5 books. And then the timeline really slows down. So in Genesis, we're covering thousands of years of time. And by the end of Genesis, the timeline was already slowing down. Those last 10 or more chapters were devoted to the life of Joseph, which was just in a few years. But we really see this timeline as well, really covering about, it's going to be about 400 or 500 years of all from the very beginning of Exodus through, but really it's going to focus on 40 years specifically of the Israelites wandering in the desert. So that's really what we're going to be jumping into especially. And each book of the Torah has a slightly different feel to it of what's trying to be explained and why it's being written. But it is primarily in chronological order, so we kind of get this flow and this narrative as we go. But at times we'll stop, like in the book of Leviticus, to really unpack the laws, or we'll stop in Numbers for another set of genealogies. And so as the narration goes, there will also be portions that are put in there of other kinds of genres and texts, but primarily historical. It's meant to be read as the history of Israel. So as we get started, this first hour, we're going to look first at a couple of overview chapters of the Torah, and then we're going to look into the book of Exodus specifically as an overview. So we're not going to actually jump into the text right off. We want to actually get a little bit more feel for the background and what exactly all of this means and what it looks like, and what are some of the major themes we're going to be hitting, the authorship and those types of things as we keep going. Again, if you did the Genesis study, some of this will be the same. The author's the same. The time period is, the same time period of the Jewish history. So let's just jump in first off. The Torah in general is the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pentateuch is another word for that. Penta means 5. And then, so we have the 5 books of Moses. They have a lot of different names. The Torah is the other one. And so, again, we might interchange these. I might call it the Pentateuch. I might call it the first 5 books. It might be kind of referred to here as even the books of Moses or the Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you've ever done a book study of the Bible or a read-through plan of the Bible, some people get going in Genesis and they really love Genesis. And then you get into Leviticus and it gets kind of, why did I start into this whole reading plan? And then by the time you hit Numbers, it's like, okay, that's all the further this year I'm going to get. Again, I don't want it to be that way. That's not the point of the Torah. The Torah is actually a very action-filled book. It shows us so much about God. And if there are sections that we might go a little faster through some of the genealogies and things, the early genealogies, like we said in Genesis, help set out the book and tell us where we are. In this, they're kind of filling into the narratives and things. There's also going to be large sections on the law and how they approach God in holiness. And you're going to be thinking, how does this even apply today? And what do we do with these? And so some of those things we'll have to address as we go. So again, we're going to just be looking at the next 4 books of the Bible. So this is going to be very condensed. Genesis, we took a whole class just for Genesis, and now we're going to look at 4 books in this next one. Again, they have a lot of overlap in them. Some of the things that are laid out maybe in Leviticus or Exodus are repeated then in Deuteronomy. Sometimes you'll have certain portions, even in Exodus, where Moses is given the commands of what they need to do and how they need to build things. And then we see that actually working out chapters later or in Leviticus, and they'll just kind of go through the routine of how that got done. And so you kind of get these repetitions too of either the priestly roles or the garments or the sacrifice systems or the tabernacle. So again, those things we'll kind of try to group together a little bit and do them a little bit more thematically in this, instead of going through every single text linearly. So again, but we will be building through the narrative because we want to look mostly at the life of Moses. I mean, he's this amazing leader, a humble man. And so that will be part of our thing. Like I said, I have the Red Sea background for this to just kind of remind us of like the amazing size and magnitude of what God's going to do here. Most likely over 1 million people that had to go through this Red Sea crossing and follow Moses and the miracles they saw with the plagues and all of this. So we're going to cover all those high points too. Just like in Genesis, we talked so much about how God kept coming. He kept appearing. He kept speaking. He kept making covenants with all the different people. He was speaking to them in dreams and covenants and in theophanies and all these different ways. And so again, that was kind of the richness behind the scenes in Genesis of what was going on, or all these encounters with God. In Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we're going to see the presence of God in a pillar of fire and smoke and cloud and coming to the tabernacle and dwelling with them and his presence among them. And so there's going to be that with Godness throughout this whole thing. And how many times Moses has said, I'm not going on unless you go with me. And we'll see Joshua pick that up at the end. And so again, this idea of God being very present. So just kind of going back to a little bit more overview of the Torah. So the Torah is specifically about history. Like when we talk about the genres, it's going to be mostly narrative, historical narrative. It's meant to be taken seriously as a history of a people group. Again, there will be some poetic or song portions occasionally in it, but generally it is seen as history. It's to tell the people who they are and where they came from. It's to talk about the genealogy leading to Jesus. Again, we will also see a lot of foreshadowing of Jesus in these. It's very foundational to our understanding of the origin of humans, cultures, societies, the Israelites, faith, and covenants, to be studying this part of the Bible. The origin of sin and the pointing towards the Messiah, the dealing with sin, worship, and holiness is a big part of this next section. So earlier, we didn't get a lot of description on why Cain and Abel were doing sacrifices, or how they were supposed to approach God, or why did Abraham set up an altar. It was just part of the narrative flow, or why he was asked to sacrifice Isaac. But here, we're going to be given a lot more of the kind of reasoning of God on how to do these things, what's acceptable, what isn't. And it's going to be very, I'm not going to say formulaic, but it's going to be very much verbalized and written down by Moses. It's going to be given as very clear instructions. And that's really what the Torah is about, is instructions. It's supposed to be exposing humans' inability to keep the law or to keep the statutes of God. We find that out in the New Testament, that the Torah really is to expose people's need for a Messiah. So all of these 4 books is pointing towards Jesus coming, that they were going to need something far beyond their own time. The animal sacrifices were all pointing towards Jesus' ultimate sacrifice. Everything that we're going to see is going to be pointing to him. And so some of this study is going to be very deep into understanding who this Messiah is that's going to come. Now, that's not pointed out in the Old Testament. I want to make that clear. Sometimes in Old Testament studies, we'll look at it only through the lens of the people of that time. We're not necessarily going to do that. We're going to actually show to what is pointing towards the Messiah that is actually read back in from the New Testament comments, typically by Paul. And so Paul makes wonderful commentary on this Old Testament section. So in general, the Pentateuch was viewed not just as law. Sometimes in the English, we refer to the Torah as the law, these 5 books. But the Torah for most of the Jewish community has always been understood as explaining the meaning of life and also teaching them the way to live, or the way to live with God. And so it was more seen as an instruction book than just a set of rules. Now, it does have rules, and we'll get into that. There are laws and things like that they needed to do. But again, not murdering somebody, loving your neighbor, knowing, some of the moral codes, but there are also sets in here we know of this was going to be also their law, their legal codes for that whole nation. Again, we don't have that today. We have our own constitutions and things in our own countries, our own legal codes. But this was everything. This was all their instructions they needed to know, things that were going to help them deal with their human situations. And it was also going to just expose how much they couldn't do on their own. And so again, for the Pentateuch, it's really crucial for explaining God, religion, the Messiah, life, death, hope, and every aspect of the human phenomenon. That's basically, in general, how this should be looked at, especially as scholars and commentators talk about it. The Torah, it's not just a set of rules. You could have written down in bullet points a set of the 10 Commandments and a few other laws, but it's not. It's actually telling them how to interact, how to worship God, how to come into things. That's why all of these laws are set within narrative. They're set within a context and a people group for a time and a place. Again, we can't just rip these out and go use them. Otherwise we're all going to have to grow long beards and wear tassels on our cloaks and things like that. And that doesn't make sense. Or stop eating bacon because they weren't allowed to eat pork. That's not really how we're going to apply this. That's not how it's meant to be applied. It was for a time and a place and a people group. And now we've moved into the new covenant and things are a little different. Now, some of the basic structure is still there. We're still not to have idols or any other gods before God or at all. So no idolatry. We're not supposed to be in sexual immorality. All of those things continue on. But again, how we deal with these things we will get into. But just knowing that the Torah was something that David talks about in Psalms 119, and I want to ground us back into that continually in this, is that he loved the law. He didn't see these as harsh punishments and rules. He saw this as a way of getting to know God's heart and God's ways. So he would meditate day and night, it says in Psalms 119, I love your law. I love the Torah. I love these books. I love to think about them. And they were told to repeat these things to their children, speak about them, write them down, put them on, their doorposts. They're supposed to love this law. They're supposed to love what it says and how it's instructing them to know God better. And it's pointing towards the Messiah, which we all need for our saving faith, right? We need to know Jesus. And so the Torah is going to speak with all the authority of the Word of God. These 5 books are foundational. They're repeated regularly in the New Testament. They're an incredibly important part of the Bible because they have such an age to them, right? They were the first ones that really are here and included. And so many of the other writers, like the prophets and the minor and major prophets, all were reading the Torah when they wrote their books. David was reading the Torah when he wrote the Psalms. We have the New Testament authors before even all the epistles and the Gospels were written in the early church. Before that part of the Bible was all there, they had the Torah they were reading. It was probably one of Paul's primary texts that he was going back to just by how much he quotes it. So again, this is a big part of the Bible and what they needed for moral instruction, what they need for authority. Again, it speaks to us today, and we just need to read it slightly differently than the people of that time period because of how it speaks to us today since Jesus has already come. Again, the interpretation's a little different, but it's still the same Bible. It's still the Holy Spirit speaking to us. And so again, it's a really important part. And I don't ever want these history books to feel like they're boring or not applying to our life. I think many times these things get misapplied. I use this quite often. I probably will, more than you'll want to hear in this class. In times of revival, a lot of holiness movements in the past have gone back to the laws and tried to take back as many laws as they could because they want to be more pleasing to God, which was a good thought, but it led them into some legalism. There's been movements where they've tossed out all the bacon or thought everybody needed to wear certain kinds of neckties or long dresses, or they've added these rules because they felt like it was coming from something from the Torah, right? Or something like that we need to revert back to all the laws. And I'm not going to make a lot of comment on that here but I just want us to love this in the Torah like David did, that it's something we can meditate on and we can see the application without making it difficult or strange in our New Testament context. Okay, so again, let's just talk genre for a minute. This is going to be narrative. We're going to primarily focus on the narrative portions of the Torah. There might be times where it describes feasts, Levitical laws, or other things. We might set those aside even as we're going through the narratives and then come back to them in a topical format to talk about all the feasts at once or do a little bit more study on different pieces of it. So again, this isn't going to be necessarily linear straight through these 4 books. It would be very difficult to read all of it too. So I will be taking portions and things like that. But in Exodus, we probably will read a decent amount of it just because the narrative is so important, especially with the life of Moses and the plagues and all the things that go on. There's so much action. There's actually very little commentary at times, just needed because of the amount of narrative. It's kind of like the book of Acts. Sometimes you read the book of Acts and you're like, wow, I'm not even sure I need to preach a sermon on this. Just reading it is enough, right? Like there's very little to do after you've read some of that. And so this narrative is kind of going to work that way a little bit too. The narratives and the stories are going to be focusing mostly on Moses, starting with his birth and ending in his death. That's exactly how this book is laid out. He lives 120 years. Start with his birth, end with his death. So it's going to cover that 120 years. And really the first like 1 or 2 chapters is going to cover 80 years of his life, maybe even in the first chapter. So most of it's going to be the other 40 years. The narrative can be thought of as accounts of characters and events to move the plot of redemption history forward. So this is not going to be talking about that one chosen family this time. In Genesis, it was. We were picking through to find out who's going to be the next chosen line. It's going to be Isaac or Ishmael. Oh, it's going to be Isaac, And so we see that happening. But again, in this one, this is going to be more about conflict, resolution. How's an entire nation going to be moving forward? How is God as the deliverer going to show himself? How is God really showing himself sovereign and working these things out? Again, there's some things we're going to have to look at. This is a narrative, a historical narrative, but we also are going to bring our interpretation to it. So how much interpretation do we need? There was very little interpretation actually given in Genesis, very little commentary, right? Was having 2 wives good or bad? Genesis didn't tell us. Was it God's best plan to have Joseph sold into slavery? We don't really know if there was a different plan that God wanted. We just know that God's plan needed Joseph in Egypt. It happened to be that he did it through that his brother sold him through slavery to do it. But could there have been a different way? Could he have been sent off to school there or something else? Or, we just don't know. It is what it is. And again, the plans of God did move forward. There wasn't, like I said, much moral commentary or interpretation of what was going on. This is going to be quite different. Now that we step into Exodus, there's going to be quite a bit of commentary given. We're going to hear about the hardened heart of Pharaoh. We're going to hear about the rebellious people. We're going to hear that they aren't doing what's right with God. We're going to kind of hear all of the things. Like we don't hear that same stuff about Abraham. It just says, oh, he went, to Egypt and tried to pass off his wife as his sister. She was taken to a harem. He let his wife go. He wasn't protective. None of that commentary is there about like, what did God think? All we hear next is that he gets the Pharaoh has a dream and kicks him out, which is probably what God wanted, but it doesn't explicitly even say that. Like it is very much you're feeling through a lot of Genesis and kind of having to read between the lines on the interpretations and things a little bit more. Here, the people make a golden calf and they are absolutely judged for it immediately. We see the sins and the rebellions and things happen under Moses. His sister ends up with leprosy. I mean, it's just immediate judgments, immediate things happening. We see the implications of everything they do. We're told straight out that a husband should not marry 2 sisters. So what Jacob did earlier with Rachel and Leah, and this time period now is explicitly written down as not a good plan and not of God. So again, we start to see kind of an unfolding of morals and interpretations in here. Not that they didn't apply to Genesis, it's just they weren't commented on in Genesis. So again, we're going to get a lot more commentary. It's going to be a lot less inference at all that's going to happen in these parts. We're going to get a lot more divine perspective on the human narratives and the human problem, right? We're going to know when people are stiff-necked, hard-hearted, and those types of things. Where before, it wasn't always clear. We just know they were chosen line or not chosen line. It doesn't like say Ishmael was hard-hearted or something like that. It just says he's not the chosen one. Isaac is. And we don't always get even the sense to know whether he wholeheartedly followed the Lord or not. Again, like I said, Rachel ends up with idols in her bag. Is that the right thing? No. But we don't see an immediate consequence to that, where here, now when someone brings idols into the camp, they and their family are destroyed immediately. So again, we're going to see some of these things kind of working through, or at least that's what I remember from that story. We'll get there when we get there, the narratives about what happens when these different things happen in their camp. So again, you get a lot more idea of the divine perspective here. I think it's helpful. I think we can learn things from that. And I love that God's heart is so on display, both in Genesis and in this book. You have to remember, being from the authorship, Moses is most likely the one that wrote this down, so he's contemporary. He's seeing what's going on. He probably has more commentary to give. Genesis, Moses wrote that as well, but it was historical. It was hundreds, if not thousands of years in the past, what he was writing about. And so he maybe doesn't have all of that feelings and knowing exactly God's heart and everything that was going on there as well. So again, that's just what it is. We're going to bring our exegetical hermeneutical skills, which hermeneutics is just the art interpretation. We're going to look for contrast, cause and effects, comparisons, climaxes, echoes, repetitions, foreshadowing, numbering, word plays, surprises. And honestly, most of this is going to be pointing towards the Messiah when we do this. We're going to see different characters that are contrasted to one another. One might be, and we saw this actually in Genesis quite a few times. We saw interactions like Judah and Tamar, and one was slightly more righteous than the other. Again, like in that contrasting sense. And we're going to see those things. Again, we saw some of this in Genesis, the east of the garden, or the number 40, being really prominent. The number 70 representing the nations, as we see those people groups continually being listed as 70 people, or those types of things in Genesis. Those same kind of things are going to happen, and probably even with more frequency in these 4 books. As we look at the symbolism in the temple, we look at the symbolism in the feasts and the atonements and sacrifices and all of that going on. So the narratives have a setting, timeline, characters, and events. And it's something we need to be very careful of. We cannot read ourselves in this modern era under the new covenant into the exact same setting and places that they are. They didn't have the Holy Spirit in the same way. They didn't have the same time. They had different events going on. Again, we can learn from it, but we can't immediately jump into it, right? We can't just go set up some wilderness wandering group that we want to do for the next 40 years and put down these exact same rules and start over. That would be the wrong application and reading of this. We need to learn from it. It needs to be authoritative to our lives, but it needs to be sensible. Again, and that's where the Holy Spirit and those types of things and good exegetical hermeneutic things come in. Again, the narratives have settings, and we just need to be also very careful. Exodus 2 is going to cover 80 years. And then Exodus 3 through 38 is going to cover 2 years. So again, we might have some chapters that are very rushed in their timeline, others that are very long and extended. And so as we go between those two things, just remember, this is narrative. Narratives can play. Narratives are going to sometimes expound on people's hearts or what they're thinking. That's what historical biographies do. We actually see this in the Gospels and some of the other things. It's not necessarily how American or English people write books nowadays. We usually don't infer what the character's thinking, feeling, or their heart position. But in ancient biographies, this was quite normal to infer what somebody was thinking or doing or saying. So the storyteller is going to control what they include and what they leave out. There's going to be so many more questions that we're going to have than what the storyteller tells us in Genesis, right? Moses is writing this. It's to his people in his time, place, and he gets to put in and leave out any parts of the narratives he finds that he and God obviously inspiring him to put in and take out. There's things that we still ask, what kind of animals did Noah have on the ark, right? Like even from Genesis, how did creation really work? What was this? What was the timeline on that? Some of that just doesn't even get answered. Sometimes we just get some vague timeline. Things are going on, and we get some characters here or there, and we have usually, I walk away at least, with more questions than answers. And that's where we want to be careful that we don't just start conjecturing theology or storylines into things. And I kept saying that in Genesis, like especially with like Joseph, I'll hear conjectures like, oh, he was such a arrogant young man sharing his dreams with brothers that didn't want to hear it. And then you'll hear somebody else conjecture their thoughts that, oh, he was such an upright man, nothing bad said of him, and he was just sharing his God-given dreams, and the people around him were rejecting him. He should have kept sharing them. He was just a rejected prophet. So again, you get these two takes. Some people take him as arrogant, and he shouldn't have been sharing, and other people saying he was sharing the heart of God, and he should have been saying those things about his dreams and what was going to happen, his brothers bowing down to him. Again, those are two different takes on the exact same narrative. And in certain places, I can see both of those being good applications for today, but we don't necessarily know what was happening in that time period. So the author really is going to control what information we have. And then as we go, we're going to have to remember that this narrative is going to be interrupted. Poetry, songs, law, instructions. We're going to have the buildings of this and that, and it's going to interrupt the narrative. That's why I said that's like over 30 chapters. We only get through 2 years. So we're going to get some very nitty-gritty things in there as we go through that end of Exodus. The other thing we want to say is that we're going to spend quite a bit of time in this story. I want to make sure we highlight when we come up on something that's a typology of Jesus or the Messiah to come. We had this actually in Genesis where Jacob was a type of David. David is a type of Messiah. We have also Jacob, Joseph, Judah, and David all pointing to Christ, right? They're all kind of carrying pieces, like David explicitly as a Messiah. He's an anointed one. It's a little m Messiah. Jesus will be the Messiah. But we see many Messiahs through the Old Testament, prophets, priests, and kings that were anointed ones. They're supposed to look like the ministry. We're going to see that heavily in the ministry of Moses. He was a prophet, and Jesus will be the ultimate prophet. So there's many things that Moses does that Jesus is going to fulfill then in his ministry as the prophet. And so all of these things are pointing towards Jesus. A lot of these characters are pointing towards Jesus. And so again, the stories are sometimes the narrative patterns that we're going to see are types of story patterns. We see a similar creation storyline to the flood line, and then we're also going to see that then in the Exodus as the building of the new nation. And so we have these beginnings or creation stories, right? Creation of the world, recreation of the world, and then a creation of the nation. All of them include the wind, the parting of water in some way, right? That has to be parted for dry land. So we see these things, right? This nation's going to come across on dry land. And I'm going over this very quickly, but that's just some of the typologies that we're going to see is that there's certain types and storylines that keep getting redone to kind of make a point that it's a creation story. You have these elements when you have that kind of story. We have that still also with these characters. We're going to see some of these characters follow that. Again, we don't want to overdo typologies. I've seen that happen a lot too, connecting things that aren't there. I've seen people try to point to like every last thing in the story as a type of this or that. Again, we want to be a little careful. Sometimes it's just a camel going on a trip with somebody to do something, so again, we want to be a little bit careful there. Again, I always warn everyone, anytime we have a novel thought or a connection that isn't really there, or hasn't been said somewhere else, typically that novelty is just another word for an error or even possibly a heresy. We don't want to be too innovative with our theology. Orthodoxy means that we're going to stick to the history of what was meant by this and how it goes. And so again, but there are some really beautiful types. We have Isaac, right? He was that long-awaited child. Well, we have the long-awaited Messiah. He was promised. So was Jesus. He was used as a symbol of a sacrificial lamb. Jesus was going to be sacrificed as that lamb as well. He was nearly sacrificed on the site of the temple to come. Jesus would be sacrificed, not on that same site, but in that same idea of being the ultimate sacrifice of the lamb. So that would be a typology of Isaac to Jesus. And I love that a lot of Isaac's life being that long wait, that promised child. We see those exact same elements. We're going to see this idea of exiting out of Egypt, that even Jesus, Matthew points out, exited out of Egypt. When he was 2, they'd fled there. He's going to be under some of the same conditions as Moses. Moses had almost been killed by a kingly decree of all the males. And Jesus is going to the same thing when he's born in Bethlehem. All the male children are to be killed and they have to flee to Egypt. So again, we see these things happen many times. And so these typologies, these foreshadowings of what's going to come in Jesus's story. Okay, so this just means that God's word is permanent throughout time. It means that it's going to endure through all the generations, and it's going to testify the same way it always has. The Torah is no less relevant now to our lives and no less part of the Bible just because it was from a long time ago. We need to know who created the world, why God did it, how he did it, what he was saying to people, how he entered into covenants. Those covenants weren't just completely abolished. They were fulfilled in Jesus, right? We see that Jesus fulfilled the Torah and the law, and therefore we come into him through grace. And so again, just some of these things that we're seeing in this is going to speak to us today. We're going to just continue to read these narratives. A lot of the narrative people we can relate to deeply, right? It's still the human condition. It's still God intervening in it. It helps us to understand our lives, our meaning, and individually in society and God himself. And I also know a lot of us are longing to be a part of a bigger story, part of a family. And even if you have a messed up family or a family that's not believers, this grounds us back into the first family, into the first nation, and into what we're grafted into, right? We're all even Gentiles, and come into faith, become children of Abraham through faith. We become grafted in, and this becomes our faith family. It becomes our spiritual story. And so if you've always longed first spiritual family or family. This is now, these are your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents. This is your story, right? And so we see Moses as one of those people. We've seen Jacob and Isaac and Abraham and how they lived by faith. And we can see them as mentors even in our faith and the way they lived it. Now, I love the Bible because it gives us both their positives and their stumbles and their problems and their sins. And we can learn from all of that from them. I love the honesty and the authenticity of this family story. So again, I want to ground us back into that very heavily, that when we come into the new covenant in Christ, we come into Christ, but we come into the entire family, the lineage, and everything that spiritual family, not only our current church family, but the history of all the saints and faith-filled men and women that went before us. And so we have this long history. Okay, so continuing in this overview of the Torah, which obviously you can see why it's so important to us. It's going to be these instructions. Genesis is going to close with the blessings of Jacob on his sons. And if you missed that, go back to the Genesis series. He blesses each of his 12 sons, and we talked about a little bit how those blessings played out. Most of those blessings won't actually play out till the book of Joshua when the land is divided and they kind of get their inheritance. A lot of Jacob's blessings were about where they're going to dwell in the land, next to the seashore, in the mountains, how that was going to work out. And then, so we see how that family line and everything closes in Genesis. We've seen that whole development of family. Exodus is going to pick up with the story of 12 families or tribes of Israel. It's going to end with God's presence filling the tabernacle. So we're going to see this development now of all 12 tribes. They're going to come into this nation in Exodus. In Leviticus, it's going to open with God's calling to Moses from inside the tabernacle. His tabernacle is filled with his presence, and he's going to call for Moses. Leviticus finishes with a series of regulations for right worship of God. Leviticus is all about how do we have a holy God who has decided to dwell among us and not die as sinful humans, right? He's going to give them a whole set of things they need to do, ritual worship, things that's going to happen for them to be able to even approach him. And so he's saying, I'm going to be so intimately involved. It's not going to be an encounter here, an encounter there, like he was having with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. They would go to the altar and then he would come and speak to them. No, he's going to be among them. He's going to be with them. Moses is going to be meeting with him continually, like throughout the entire thing. He's going to be present and available. They don't have to go to this place and this one time have this encounter. He's there. And so how are they going to be able to handle that as such sinful and rebellious people? How is this going to work out, having these two things next to each other, the sinful people and the holy God in the same camp? So that's Leviticus, all about worship. And then Numbers starts with the tribes worshiping, and then it moves on. And it's going to go through all the tribes in Numbers, right? It's called Numbers for a reason. Lots of counts, lots of people names. Again, we'll summarize some of that. Deuteronomy begins with the Israelites on the plains of Moab making preparations to enter the land of promise. Deuteronomy really is the summary of everything that happened. It's the benediction of Moses, and it's them just about to step into the promised land and the leadership moving from Moses to Joshua. And them reaffirming the covenant. We've had a whole generation die off, and they've got to come back and really make sure that they mean it this time. That first generation didn't have the desire to fight. They heard there were giants. I mean, we know they would have turned back and gone to Egypt if they'd even encountered any kind of warfare. They were completely not ready for any of this. They didn't want it. They were difficult. They constantly were rebelling against God. And then we have the second generation that's not doing much better. And they need to reaffirm the covenant. They need to get some stuff straightened up. And they're going to be the ones to go in and fight. At least they have the resolve to fight. So again, we're going to see that kind of development happen in the people group over this time period. We're going to also see a lot about the character of God in these books. We're going to see God revealing himself, right? We're going to talk about this a little bit. God seems to not unfold his plan of redemption, right? In the Old Testament, they knew a Messiah was coming. They didn't know it was Jesus and all the historical details, but they did know about a Messiah. That's what they hoped, and that's how they were saved in the Old Testament, was by faith in a Messiah. And then as we go, we're going to see that God's going to show himself. And he kind of has this self-revelation that's unfolding. In Genesis 1, he's the creator God, right? We see this massive, awesome God that creates the whole universe. And by Genesis 2, he becomes intimately involved. He breathes in them and he comes near to them. He becomes the intimate God. And we even see the word Elohim and Yahweh being used in those two ways, the great God and the close, near God. In Moses, this book is going to kick off with Moses having an encounter in a burning bush and God revealing his name. Jacob had wrestled with him and asked, "What's your name?" And he didn't tell him. He just blessed him. But Moses gets the name of God, I am. And so again, we see the Yahweh and the name of God being a large part of this. We see God as creator, and now we're going to see him as deliverer and redeemer. And so some of the attributes of God are being slowly unfolded as the Bible goes forward. It's not all just dropped on us in Genesis 1. We actually see as the story unfolds, we see more and more about God. We see God's activity in creation, redemption, revealing his love and gracious intentions. Again, there's going to be a large portion. I know a lot of people get stuck on the laws, the legalism, the harshness of God, the people groups getting wiped out, the judgments. But there's this other side that we need to understand in the Torah of this gracious, merciful, patient God. It says he could have wiped out all of Egypt in one plague, and he took 10. He was giving them time. He was compassionate. He was patient with them. But his ultimate purpose had to happen. And so, again, as we look at this, it's also what he says about them entering the promised land. You can't get there yet. They need 400 years to fulfill their sinfulness. I don't have a reason to wipe them out yet, right? Like they don't need to be displaced. They haven't completely, not everybody there is completely gone yet, like kind of idea. And so, again, Sodom it was, but the promised land isn't. So this is all in the timeline of the grace. Can you imagine 400 years they're in some sort of bondage, a lot of that in Egypt, while this other people group has their chance. They're suffering, so God can be a gracious God to this other group, and the Canaanites in the promised land currently. And so again, we're going to see that. If we want to look for it, we're going to see that God isn't a judgmental God in the Old Testament and a gracious one in the New Testament. He's really a gracious, compassionate, and has judgment all together in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. We don't see a different God. This isn't God with two faces. It's the same God over both testaments and time periods. Yes, now we personally interact with God slightly differently because there was an old covenant and now there's a new one. So our agreement with him and our relationship is different. We now have the Holy Spirit inside of us and we can boldly enter into his presence. So again, it is a little different. Just going back a little bit to the Torah, yes, this is going to be laws and instructions. There are 613 laws embedded in it. It's all about God's will and living instructions. So how is God going to prevail is going to be the big question here over the human resolution and revolutions and rebellions. The people are really not getting it most of the time. And God is going to be able to be, like I said, a contrast or juxtaposition of being that very gracious God against this rebellious people. So again, let's just rehearse the history a little bit. God speaks everything into existence. This is redemption history of people and God. So we're going to kind of talk about that sovereign. He speaks everything. He makes it perfect. He says, this is good. Everything listens. Everything listens to God in creation except for man who rebels, right? They all follow his instruction. The sun goes where he says, everything else except for people. Humans rebel against the single God, a single command God gave them. They were only given one thing they couldn't do and they still did it. So again, this wasn't a long list at that time. It wasn't 613 laws. They only had one. God spoke his answers and his promises immediately to them that he was going to provide a seed who would crush the head of the enemy. He then goes on to give promises to Abraham, to a seed, to the land, to the blessings of Abraham. He's going to have all of this. And then Joseph gets to interpret the events in his story. The things that that people did that were evil, God uses them for good to accomplish his work. So we see the sovereign redemption plan go through the very troubled humanity. From the beginning, humans are doing everything they can to mess up this plan, it seems, right? Adam sinning, Abraham, tries to leave the land, doesn't know where he's going to get the child from. We have Joseph, who's getting sold into slavery by his brothers. Like everything that could go wrong seems to be going wrong, but yet the plan of redemption continues. We're going to see this continue into Exodus. The plan is going to open with the king of Egypt who has now forgotten Joseph, but God has not forgotten his people and his word to Abraham. And so that's exactly how the book opens. We're going to have God deliver his people by Moses, right? Even though these people are under a very rebellious Pharaoh and they themselves are stiff-necked, we're going to see God even work around hard-hearted and stiff-necked people. God's going to speak to them. He's going to give them the law. And what do? First thing, off the mountain, Moses comes down with the law. They have a golden calf. They've already rebelled against God's first command, do not have any other gods before me, right? And so we see this. In spite of human failure, God is going to come and dwell among them. That's what he wants to do. And so they're going to have the tabernacle. He's given them the instruction for the tabernacle, and they can't even do law 1, which is don't have idols, and law 2. And so again, we see this happen over and over, and that's just Exodus. And then we step into Leviticus. God calls Moses to the tent of meeting. They're going to have these meetings. He gives instructions for holiness, that they can enjoy God's presence among them. And these laws are difficult, and they just keep failing at them. But God doesn't leave. He stays. He knows his holiness can kill them, and he tells Moses, get them in order, or they're going to die, right? He keeps telling them this. A plague breaks out, and thousands of them die because they've transgressed. They've gone against God's ways. And so again, Leviticus is going to be all about how can we have God among us and in our presence and not die. And they're finding this very difficult. Thankfully, in the new covenant, we have Jesus that's taking care of our sins. So it's not as difficult for God to come dwell among us, actually in us. And then Numbers is going to be the same sovereign God plan with the people. They're going to be wandering in the wilderness. They blew it. They decided not to go in the promised land. A report of a few giants, and they're out. There's almost 1 million of them, and they can't handle this. And so they end up on a 40-year journey to walk a few hundred miles. What should have taken a week takes them 40 years. So again, the people succumb to temptation, grumbling, and rebellion against God in the wilderness. It is not going well. He's providing manna. He's providing water. He's providing everything they need. And the first generation dies out. The second generation has the same sin problem. And so when is this ever going to stop? How is God ever going to have a people with his name? There's no one else to blame in the wilderness. They can't blame Egypt. They can't blame anything else. It's their own sinfulness. God takes the second generation into the promised land. He gets them in order enough to get them there. They've had the tabernacle. They've had his presence among them. They're his people. They're chosen. And he needs this to come about. There's enough of them. There's the Calebs and the Joshuas that want to do this. They're starting to get things in the right direction. Deuteronomy, they have 3 discourses as they're about to enter the promised land. They're to love God and to talk about his Torah continually. That's just a beautiful thing, right? This is supposed to be a covenant of love, not of laws. If you actually loved God and loved his commandments and loved each other, actually all of the laws flow from that. We hear Jesus say that, right? You're not going to murder somebody if you really love them. You're not going to have an idol in your home if you really love God. You're not going to go to a fortune teller or get into witchcraft if you really love God. You won't do that. You'll go to him. You'll go to him first for everything. You'll go to him every time you get sick. You'll go to him every time you have a problem. Every time you want to control something, you don't need to. You take it to God. And again, that's what we see. We too can relate to all of this. We start life as rebels. We're completely opposed to God in the gospel. I think Saul on the road to Emmaus, Paul, right? He's blinded because he's going out to murder Christians. All of us can relate with that. We didn't start in a way that we wanted God. We come to that through Jesus, through his Holy Spirit, through him changing us and changing our hearts. Okay, so that's really the main overview of the Torah. I want us to see this redemptive thread as we go through it. I want us to see what God's doing, how he's interacting with the people, and how they are not the reason that the promise comes about. And I think, if anything, that's what the Torah teaches us. It's really not about us. We have to put our faith and our trust completely in what Jesus did, because there's really nothing we did that could make this happen. And again, that's why we go back to the Torah and look, and we're like, wow, like they're blowing it again. They give them one rule, right? One rule, and they break it in Genesis. And then they're given a bunch of them, and they can't do that. And it's just this constant thing of needing deliverance and needing a savior. They can't blame it on Egypt anymore. And so I think that's one of the things we should definitely be looking in this as we, especially as we hit into Leviticus. What is true worship? What does it look like to approach God? And how absolutely grateful should we be to Jesus for everything that he did in clearing the way and opening that up to us? Because this was difficult. This is really difficult to live this way. And Jesus was a perfect living example of what it meant to live the Torah. He did it perfectly. So, and he loved people, right? All the way through. So let's jump now just into the overview of Exodus and really get started with this study. Not that we already haven't had some great takeaways. Like I said, this is a book about family. It's a book about redemption. All 5 of these books. It's about origins. It's about all of these things that we need to understand about our faith. So again, Exodus is going to be this main theme of how can a holy God live among wicked and rebellious people. But maybe the question really should be, how are the wicked and rebellious people going to live in the presence of the holy God? He seems to have decided he's going to be with them, and he's going to go into the promised land and dwell there. And he has a people group that needs to figure out how to be with him. And so we see that Moses' heart is definitely inclined. He says many times, I won't go unless you go with me. But the people don't typically say that. And so how do we end up dealing with this idea of God with them? The Emmanuel idea in the New Testament, God with us. And so again, here we are, we have God. He's going to unfold a nation's destiny. He's going to talk about this. We're going to definitely see the Passover lamb, Jesus, right? In the plagues, the last one, they paint their doorposts with the Passover lamb's blood, and they're all spared. Their oldest sons don't die. And we're going to see this journey from slavery to their new identity in God. The people need to change their mindset. And that's something that I think in Exodus we're going to deeply have to deal with, is what does it mean to move from slavery to being a son and part of that nation of God, right? They go from slaves to sons of God. Now, they had sort of been sons of God as the tribes, but they weren't really understanding that in Egypt. They were really living as slaves. They really had kind of sold themselves to Egypt. In many cases, it says they would have rather go back to Egypt than gone with God in the wilderness. Now, that doesn't make any sense, right? To us, at least. But we also go through this transition. We were slaves ensnared by the devil to do his will. It's flat out in the New Testament, just kind of quoting some scriptures together. We were in slavery to bondage, to sin, and to the devil. And then as we get saved, we come into sonship. But we have a lot of those old mindsets. And kind of like this first generation, we don't want to die, but all those mindsets, all that self needs to die. We need to start looking like people that can go fight battles, take on giants, and enter the promised land. And we can do that. We're offered to do that immediately. We can always step into that overcoming posture over sin and darkness and everything that we need to in life. But sometimes we decide to take the long path. We decide not to fight those battles, not take on giants, and take 40 years to get there. And so I think, too, if we look at this also as the spiritual side of what was really going on in their mentality, what did slavery do to them? And some of us stayed in slavery a lot longer than others. And it doesn't necessarily matter how long, but we've learned a lot of things in slavery. We learned things from our family of origin that were slave mentality. We learned things from the culture around us that are slave mentality. We've even just felt things in the atmosphere from evil that's lied to us our whole life about how worthless we are, how much we can't do. I mean, it can be simple things like, well, my family does it this way. Have you ever asked God how he does it? Well, no. So sometimes it's even just our preconceived things we fall back on, just our family thinking, our cultural thinking. That's not necessarily what God wants to do in this situation. And so again, we tend to have a slave mentality. We tend to root ourselves in our original thinking. That's why Paul says to renew your minds. So we will be looking at that quite heavily, especially in Exodus as we're moving. And I'm going to point out sometimes they just wouldn't fight their battles. We've got to fight our battles, right? Like we have to be willing. And it's not that we're fighting them on our own. Most of the battles were won in very odd ways in Joshua's time. They march around a city and its walls fall down. Like these battles don't get taken out in a very like normal, they just go in and they fight for themselves. No, I mean, at one point Moses has to raise his hand when during a battle. And so again, they're supernaturally empowered to win these battles in God's direction. We're going to just see that this idea of God being gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in love and faithfulness is going to be like a key verse in Exodus. We're going to see that as one of the highlights. We're also going to see probably one of, I think, the most obviously the Gospels are amazing, but profound encounters of the entire Bible is Moses and God on the mountain and seeing him face to face, and Moses coming down shining with the glory of God. Again, we're going to see other things where the power and the awe of God comes over the people, that they are scared because of the darkness and the noise and everything from the mountain that they've come to approach God at, that they get so scared they only send Moses up. Again, it's just going to be a profoundly significant book for setting down how amazing and big God is, but how much he wants that face-to-face encounter with Moses, and how transformational that is to see the glory of God, how different Moses is than so many of the other people. And we're going to also see the character of Joshua, who's a worshiper, who's going to end up taking over. He's the one that's lingering in the tent of God and meeting. And we're going to see how important this close, intimate connection. So the mighty majesty of God, but also this closeness. And I think this is all in Exodus. Right? So if we thought that the storyline wasn't going to keep up with Genesis, I think this does. So we're not going to get in too deeply about Exodus's timeline. In general, it's 120 years. It has certain dates. The dates are mostly around when things were happening in Egypt and how that gets dated. Archaeology and those things tend to have different dates and what they consider. Conservative scholars tend to date it much earlier. Also, it's not happening down by the pyramids. The time in Egypt is most likely up in the northern area by the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile River Delta, where they were given land. And they were really living as a separated community up there of the Hebrews in a lot of ways. The Egyptians were using them to build storehouses and cities and things as slave labor. So again, they would have had influences, but when we even see the plagues, some will fall only on the Egyptians and not on the Israelites. So they were kind of living in some separate encampments in a certain way. We have in many places that Moses is the author. Exodus explicitly calls him out as the author in multiple places, and New Testament authors note regularly that Moses is the author of the Exodus particularly, but the Torah in general. And so again, there's not really any reason. Now, there might have been some edits, like we said. There's certain words here and there that seem to come from a much later date. They refer to the kings of Israel, which obviously hadn't happened in Moses' time. So again, it seems like there were certain edits and things. Maybe some of the city names were updated, maybe around the time of David or even after the exile. So again, you can read commentaries on that. Why was this book written in Exodus? It was for deliverance and redemption. You're going to see the theme of God wanting to be the deliverer and seen as the deliverer of the people throughout. God rescues them from oppression, and they are to generationally, from here forward, celebrate the Passover every year as a commemoration of his deliverance. So part of this book is being written as an instruction to them on how to remember God and how to have this very important feast. It would be like somebody writing a book to tell all of Western world how to do Christmas the same way, or something like that, but something with a deep meaning, with the nativity and those types of things, right? The Gospels kind of have that. But again, I was kind of thinking the other kind of Christmas days and things. Maybe Thanksgiving here in the United States, it's more of just an American holiday. If we had like a book on that. Moses is kind of including some of that. He's setting down the national precedents and also what holidays they're going to have. And all of their holidays are about God and something major he does. Some of the richest theology of the Old Testament is found in Exodus. Redemption, law, ethics, morality, and worship are all set out in some of these things. Priesthood and covenants are highlights of the theology we're going to see. And we're going to see God highlighted as truthful, faithful, patient, mercy, holy, and the judge. He's both powerful and he's with them. Right? I'm going to keep saying that. He's transcendent and he's immanent. He's mighty and he's personal. And so we see these things come up. We're going to see three major themes of God's plan for deliverance: his guidance in their moral and daily lives for holiness, and then his order for worship. And worship meaning their sacrifices, all of the things that go into worshiping God. So we see this. We're just going to see that is how the book is going to kind of lay out these major themes of theology. We're going to see a major outline where they're going to move from Egypt into the wilderness. We're going to see that we need to kind of have Moses' birth and storyline first. We're going to have him meet God at the bush. We're going to have the plagues. We're going to have the Passover. We're going to have the Egyptian army thrown in the sea. We're going to have these big moments happen. And then we're going to have the wilderness where the grumbling starts. The Amalekites are going to get defeated. There's going to be judges appointed. And then we're going to move to the mountain with the covenant, the instructions for the tabernacles and everything that they need, the priesthoods and all the stuff that's going to happen. And so that's going to be kind of how the book is going to end. And then we're going to have them actually follow through and build that. And then the presence of God comes and ends the book there. And again, this isn't the end of our study, but this is the book of Exodus, the first part of our study. So again, what is our historical study? Historical setting. Like I said already, this is just going to pick up with Jacob's family and the 12 tribes. They are in bondage. They're in slavery. There's a bunch of events going on. And again, this is going to be kind of this very fast-paced narrative of spectacular events, big miracles. Everything's going to happen. Supernatural rescues by God. They're going to be right at the edge of the Red Sea with the whole army approaching them. What's going to happen? Are they going to be destroyed or not? And the sea parts, right? God gives them a way to walk out of the situation where there was no other way. And how much, we relate to these things immediately, right? Like you could feel that God is going to speak to each one of us like I've done that in your life too. You're right on that edge. You hit rock bottom and you're finally ready for me to come and get you. Again, it's not that they're walking across on the dry land because no one's pursuing them or something cool just needs to happen. No, this is like the only way out. Okay, so they're going to get to know God who loves them perfectly, even though they're imperfect people. And we're going to just continue to have this storyline with God. He's going to show himself as powerful, caring, and awesome in glory and majesty. Again, I'm just kind of going over some of the highlights. Again, Moses is also going to be a highly relatable person. He's going to start as a murderer. He's going to be on the run. He's going to end up with a very boring life for 40 years out tending some sheep in a desert with no real promise of anything coming. And then all of a sudden he sees a burning bush and everything changes. He's sent on this incredible adventure full of miracles that are happening there as he puts his staff down. Now he's going to have to go do all these in public in front of the Pharaoh in a life-threatening situation. Again, in the midst of this, he's saying how inferior he is. He's just this guy that lives in the desert. I mean, he stutters. He just can't do this. He has no ability to do this. And God's like, I've called you. You're the man I want. Your heart's right. And so God is looking at not his qualities and his talents. Like with David, we find out that God doesn't look at outward appearance, stature, and bigness and tallness, right? He's going to look at his heart. Well, we see the same thing with Moses. God isn't looking for the most talented person, the one with all the qualifications that already has the right standing in the right courtroom. No, he's going to move Moses to where he needs him to be, and he's going to do everything. He's like, I don't care if you can't talk. I mean, he says, then take your brother. But I don't want you to have fear. I want you to just be able to do this wholeheartedly and follow me and trust me. You don't need talents. Just put your stick on the ground. It'll turn into a snake. Pick it up again. It'll turn back into a rod. Like he's saying, none of these things you naturally can do on your own. So that's highly relatable too, right? We have these characters that I think all of us have had those moments of what God asks us to do is far beyond us. And it should be. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a God calling on your life. And so we will touch on that. I love going through this in our Design and Destiny class, talking about our callings, how God reveals himself, shows us our identity, and then gives us the plan. And the inferiorness of us in that plan is always the first thing we see when he's just told us our identity. You're my sons, I'm going with you. Our daughters, I'm going with you. And then, we have all these, but I can't, and this, and I'm not that smart, and I'm not that good at, and God's like, but I'm going with you. And Moses picks that up. He realizes all that matters is that he is a weak, incapable person on his own. And if God doesn't go with him, there's no point. And he says that over and over through the book. He is constantly dependent on God. And that is probably why he's called the humble man. And so again, moving our dependence onto God, I think is part of this. The overview, again, we have this overview. It's going to be a lot of covenant things. We're going to see a lot of just the storyline of Abraham move forward as we go. And again, there's going to be some very complex subjects like the tabernacle and tent of meeting and some detailed things and feasts and stuff. Again, let's not get bogged down completely in all of that. We want to also just make sure that we really catch the narrative of what's going on, how God interacts with people. And so that's going to be a major, major thing. Again, we're going to see God's grace shown through all of this. I kind of gave, if you have the notes, like I said, you can always sign up for the newsletter and get the notes, or if you're enrolled in the class, it would be in the class notes for this. But again, there's just an outline of what's going to happen. They're going to end up out at Mount Sinai, really getting these instructions and having this time in the wilderness. And really that initial wilderness time before the rebellion where they refused to fight the giants is only a few months. I think it's about 3 months or something, where they could have only taken a 3-month journey to become a nation and get everything right. Basically go, over their constitution, their laws, set up the tabernacle, get their worship set up, all the things they need for God to go with them in the promised land. But it ends up taking them 40 years. I mean, the actual physical trip, if they just went straight to the promised land, would have been a week or two. They did need that side time to go put together the nation for a couple of months. But really after that, they were supposed to go take the land and they didn't. And so they end up out there for 40 years. So again, we're going to see all of that as it comes up in Exodus. So let's just stop there. I think this is a great place to end our overview. I love going over the big picture. Again, we're going to start getting into the very small details from here on out. And so having this big picture in mind of what the point is, what the theme is, it might even be something you want to revisit a few times as we go so we don't get stuck just seeing the details. Because even in the next lecture, I know we're going to go over we're going to go over the birth of Moses and then into the 9 plagues after that. Some of them get very detailed and we start to lose the big picture. But let's also just keep these big themes in mind. And I want to make sure we step into them because I feel like there's a lot of power on them. I feel like they're really the point of what we have today, like the family, the spiritual family, and the miracles of God and Him being with us and keeping those priorities. How do we recenter our lives to look like Moses' life? How do we do this? This is going to be a study primarily, like I said, on the life of Moses. How do we end up looking more like him? And that's pretty much what I'm hoping we get from this.